Welcome everybody to this Action Sustainability Fishbowl session on carbon and how we can look at altering and changing our ways and ways of working and ways of living with respect to carbon and climate change. My name's James Cadman. I'm going to be your host and facilitator for the day, and I've got three guest speakers with me, and thank you to them for joining. So we've got David March, Group Environmental Manager at ENGIE. And we've got Joel Cardinal, Head of Energy and Sustainability at Warwick University, and Michelle McAteer, Carbon and Compliance Manager at Balfour Beatty. So the idea for today's session is a fishbowl webinar. You're going to be listening to us having a conversation around climate change, lockdown, COVID-19, and the opportunity that this may or may not present to us for reducing our carbon and hitting our net zero targets for 2050. And just before I hand over to the speakers, just go through a few practical issues. As you know, for most webinars, there's a chat function. If you've got a specific question that you'd like the speakers to address or comment, please write it in there, and myself and my colleague Alfie will moderate that, and we'll put those questions into the mix to the speakers as we go along. Before we have the conversation session, each of the three speakers will give a short piece from their own point of view as to how they see things from a climate change perspective within their own organisations, and particularly in the current context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Before we get into that, I just want to give some context. There's loads of data out there these days around sustainability, climate change, and notwithstanding the fact that we've got the pandemic, it's even more so. So I'm sure you've seen and noticed lots of stats and information about cleaner air, reduced levels of airplane flights, the contrails in the sky, for example, and all those funny pictures of goats running around North Welsh towns. Things have changed. They're starting to get back to normal a little bit, albeit 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but things have definitely changed. When it comes to global carbon emissions, there's been lots of papers produced by the likes of Nature and other journals about the reduction. And at its peak, carbon emissions went down by about 26% globally when everyone was in lockdown, or the majority of people were in lockdown. And it's been estimated that the overall impact on this year's carbon emissions globally will be somewhere between 4 and 7% compared to the previous year, just depending on how quickly and how soon most nations come back out of lockdown conditions. This number is actually quite important for those of you who aren't aware, because if we are to reduce our carbon emissions globally to hit 2050 net zero targets, we've got to reduce our emissions by 7% or more year on year for the next 12 years or more, so that we hit the target of restricting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what we've achieved in the last few months has been by an inadvertent cause, but it demonstrates that the level of cuts that we need to make in our carbon emissions if we have any chance of hitting those IPCC targets. So what we want to discuss today is, well, what is this opportunity we have? What is this ability that the pandemic lockdown has given us to think more long term about how we can change the way we work, how we live, how we offer our products and services to our clients and our customers? What opportunities are out there? So we're going to have a conversation around that. As I say, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to chuck into the mix, please feel free. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who's going to give us a little bit from their perspective, and that's David.
Great, thanks, James. Can I just check you can hear me?
We can, yes. Yep.
Fantastic. Paranoia averted. So yes, as James has introduced me there, I'm Dave March. I'm the Group Environmental Manager at ENGIE. ENGIE are a services, construction and energy generation unit. My role for them for the last couple of years now has been developing both a zero carbon and a zero waste strategy for the business. I've got experience across construction, refurbishment, responsive maintenance, facilities management, and energy generation most recently. And so when I talk through the next hour with Michelle and Joe and James, I'll try and touch upon as many areas as possible for those of you on the call. With regards to the lockdown, I thought what might be useful is just reflecting for a moment on how it transpired. So I'm sure the other members of this call will agree with me that a lot took place before the official lockdown actually kicked in. For me, public transport largely dropped off in mid-February, and we didn't really have any flights or even train journeys occurring even in the beginning of March. The fleet transportation actually didn't change very much right up until the lockdown came into effect. It might have even increased a little bit. So I think that's quite interesting, and that could also be an indicator of what might happen as we all start to return more to work, particularly in the central functions as well. There might be more hesitancy to use public transport than private and business vehicles. So that's an interesting little observation there. At the moment, our carbon footprint is anywhere from a third to 2/3 less than it was this time last year. Significant reduction, not just in our operational and transport activities, but also in our energy generation, because we largely do embedded generation for customers, whether they be car manufacturers, leisure, hospitals. Obviously some of those areas have seen an increase in consumption requirements. Many others, it's dramatically fallen. We actually worked for a couple of airports, so you can imagine the impact we've seen in that area. I've only got a couple more minutes, so I thought I'd just touch upon a couple of points to introduce this from my perspective. In the workplace, I think the lockdown has resulted in permanent changes in the way we work. We are already downsizing and consolidating some of our office space. There's already up to 600 desks essentially being removed from our portfolio in the UK, and that will largely act as the pilot and a trial for what moves forward. It'll be really interesting when we discuss this aspect later on as a group, some of the challenges that we have we find that most of our offices are most heavily populated on a Monday. If we downsize our offices and then everyone decides to still turn up 9 AM on a Monday, we're going to have a massive problem. So actually there is a lot that we're working on there in terms both of technology, with new additions to our meeting room booking system to essentially book entire desks and areas, but also a cultural piece, try and encourage people to liaise with other teams to spread out when they appear in the office. With regards to travel, again, just to link in a couple of points, we've got some really interesting considerations around our electric vehicles, with some really bold commitment. However, the lockdown has, we suspect, reduced our average mileage, might undermine some of our business, where we do need to achieve a certain mileage EVs to actually justify the return on investment. So it's an interesting point for us to discuss there. I hope that we'll be able to spend some time exploring the benefits we've seen from working at home. Certainly there are well-being, budgetary. People are often talking about the money they're saving, not transporting themselves to work every day. And there's certainly environmental benefits beyond the travel itself. I'm quite guilty of buying takeaway lunch when I go into the office. I obviously haven't been doing that since March. So the carbon and plastic and other packaging savings that we're seeing there scaled up across the whole workforce is potentially another massive and at least partially lasting effect of this situation. At the same time, we have seen cats, children, dogs, the postman, all kinds of disruptions, stresses on working from home, which I think sometimes are funny, particularly as I don't have to deal with them quite so much, but for others have been a real source of pain and adaptation to the extreme. If I fast forward, because I've probably used up my time now, I was going to summarise and finish on the point that James has already made. Whilst I am broadly positive, many of the changes that we've seen as a result of lockdown are proving what I think most of us knew was possible. They have had to happen, and therefore they have. I am still very much cautious that the reduction we have seen only meets 1 year's reduction requirements in line with Paris. As James has pointed out, we would need to double down on this every year for the next decade. And I do wonder, with the current economic and political marketplace out there, how likely that is. There's clearly a role for business as well as broader society to double down on this if we do try and actually achieve that Paris target. That's it from me right now, James. Thanks for your time.
Super, thank you, David. No, some interesting points in there, particularly around the home working piece and the balance between the savings that people have potentially made carbon-wise and other environmental and sustainability and well-being savings or benefits, and what the balance has been. Just as a kind of a nugget to drop in there, I've been on calls with healthcare purchasing professionals lately, and as we've all seen in the news, the need for PPE has been crucial the last few months, and what the resulting environmental impact on that is starting to emerge, particularly single-use plastics, but also all the waste that's been generated. So there's definitely been a spike there in consumption and the concomitant carbon, embedded carbon, and so on. So there's pros and cons. Wonderful. Joel, we'll come to you next. If you want to give us your views over the last few months, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Joël Cardinal. My role is to work at the University of Warwick, so that's just outside Coventry, looking after energy and sustainability. So just for reference, if you're not familiar, University of Warwick, that's about 27,000 students, nearly 7,000 staff. So we usually look at us as a little town of 30,000 people, because the campus, except lockdown periods, which seems to be happening now, we are running 24/7, so, and 12 months a year with conferences, art center, sports center. So it's very much of a public places with activities anywhere from accommodation, halls of 7,000 rooms of students, hotels and offices and so on. So that's the interesting part, and we do generate half of our heat and power. So that has some similarities with what David was saying in terms of self-generation and the need and the complexity for transitioning this to a lower carbon. But the interesting part is probably that as an education body, we're lucky enough that we've done some homework, and the university has declared climate emergency back in September 2019. So we are, since the last few months, effectively working into an agenda where we have set ourselves a target to reach net zero carbon emission from the energy use. So that's carbon emission scope 1 and 2 for you and me, and scope 1, 2, 3 net zero carbon by 2050, which is the same as UK and many other countries. So we now have a fairly clear agenda to work in front of us. But that gives interesting things to consider in the rest of our time this afternoon, because the university, as I said, generates half of its heat and power, and effectively we find ourselves that we've been spending a lot of time and energy, and best part of £13 million, improving efficiency and carbon emission, but very much limited to scope 1 and 2. So we can now see that just managing carbon emissions from the energy is a lot of work. If we now add scope 3, which is indirect carbon emission, into our supply chain or what we buy, that's now 73% of our carbon emission in total. So a lot bigger, with people we don't know and control directly. So if we spend 10 years doing the small bit, are we going to be able to do the large part in the time in front of us? So that's certainly an interesting reflection for me. Now, looking closer at lockdown, we have been able to do a bit of a snapshot, really, and we found interesting things, the same as what David says: commuting, no commuting. We do a usual travel survey every couple of years, which for the university, because we have so many staff and students commuting back to their place of living, we have estimated 27,000 tons of carbon every year of just commuting, going back and home every day. That come to zero during lockdown. So that's a lot of carbon being saved. And as David pointed and James, lockdown is very much an indicator of what's possible. or what's difficult, but also an indicator of how much the scale of reducing by 7 or 8% means. So for me, it's more of an indicator than an achievement, and I think I certainly join David on this. All the things very surprising to us is printing, university, teaching, research, lots of printing, lots of paper, big organization. Over the last probably 4 or 5 months of lockdown, we have not printed 2.4 million pages of paper. For you and me, that is about 500 tons of carbon not emitted. So I think part of the indicator is just to reflect on the fact that there are lots of things we do every day, and we don't really know how much carbon and footprint impact it has. And that's what I've been trying to highlight to myself and my colleagues over the last few weeks. So this is, for me, the highlighting the difficulty in terms of, I think the education sector certainly, but perhaps most of the industries, and I think to a degree governments in the same way. People have been talking about carbon emissions for many years now. Maybe not much has happened, but the main drawback now for me is that people who know a little bit are likely to associate those carbon emissions to energy use. And if I see a wind turbine at the back of my garden, problem solved. Whereas what we're now saying with the long-term scope-free, all carbon emissions included, we're saying that no, it's not more than that. It's transport, it's food, it's moving around. And I'm afraid, I'm very concerned people do not know what this is and what it means. If I take a flight to go to Spain for a weekend, I've no clue how much that is. I think I've seen some companies may try to offset, but I've no idea how much it represents. And then that's for me, and maybe because I'm part of an education body, this is probably one of the most difficult things we would have to do, is make people understand that we all have an impact on the carbon emission of this country, and we can take actions, but do we know what size of action we have to take? Probably not. The other thing that probably we're not talking about too much, which is even probably a bigger problem, is carbon's great to talk about carbon, but how do we talk about natural resources? Yes, we kind of understand fossil fuel is a natural resource and we're going to run out at some point maybe, but what about the other natural resources? I think people talk about probably fairly easily about water, but there are other resources like rare earth material and others. We don't quite relate buying a new mobile phone to how much harm it does to the environment, maybe somewhere in China. So this is the education part, which I think is probably not too much discussed. And probably the opportunities that there are lots of things we can do, and it's such a satisfaction to see that so many businesses are mobilizing. We know that by probably force of constraints, one of our buildings being built on the campus was in a tiny corner. The company has decided to do more off-site construction, and just the fact of doing this has reduced delivery to site by 80%, and putting a bit more of a wood into the beam structure rather than steel is reducing, well, it's probably going to store another 370 tons of carbon. So there's lots of opportunities, but maybe just to conclude, my concern is we see those opportunities and we probably don't see the scale of what we need to talk about. And I'm afraid it's going to be probably the one of the hardest things to do in terms of engaging with the general public to make people maybe prioritizing which actions they can take at their level. So that's certainly something I would be interested to know more and debate about.
Super. Thanks, Joel. Thank you very much. Yeah, lots of ideas and thoughts there. I mean, certainly the notion that this is a complex issue that's got many dimensions to it comes through time and time again. There's one slide I've got in a slide deck somewhere that's coming to mind about the UK's grid electricity mix and how it's been decarbonised quite a lot over the last 30 odd years as we moved away from coal, the dash for gas, more investment in renewables. And I get the sense that some people or some organisations think the problem is being solved for us. The grid is being decarbonised, our electric is getting better. But there's so much else out there. There's the transport, there's the embodied material, carbon, and so on. So, no, some really interesting points. Thank you, Joel. Last but not least, I'm going to hand over to Michelle from Balfour Beatty for your intro. Thank you.
Thanks, James. So my name is Michelle McAteer. I'm the Carbon and Compliance Manager at Balfour Beatty, and Balfour Beatty is a large infrastructure and construction company. We operate globally, mainly 3 key geographies is Hong Kong, UK and the US, but focusing today just on what we have seen in terms of carbon and post-COVID and during COVID. So my role then Balfour Beatty, I'm the compliance manager, so I'm responsible for like the old CRC reporting, the managed GHG, like calculating our global carbon footprint and the assurance audits that all come alongside that, and then looking ahead and sort of trying to understand and communicate back to the business in terms of reporting what's going to be expected over the next couple of years. And up to now we have quite a mature carbon and energy reporting system in place, certainly for the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Over the last maybe 3 years, we've been very conscious and aware that Scope 3 reporting is a huge part of our carbon footprint. And we've been trying to understand, one, where the information comes, how we can influence it, should we be setting targets around it, and just really trying to understand the sphere of influence that we have within our value chain. So they're all really key conversations that we're having, certainly at the minute and over the past couple of years in Balfour Beatty, and trying to understand where we're going to go as a company with new reporting. I mean, what we've seen in terms of the carbon agenda over the last 3 years outside of the company itself, I mean, there's obviously been a huge shift in terms of interest in the topic itself. There's a lot better news coverage on climate change and carbon management and carbon reporting. We've seen the school strikes, we've seen local authorities and universities, just as Joel has said there, declaring climate change emergencies. And they're all playing a significant role, even within Balfour Beatty, because we're now seeing as well employees are coming and they're not afraid to ask the question and holding the business to account and saying, well, what are we going to do about it, and how can we make a difference, and what should we be doing, what's credible, what's not credible. And we're trying to answer all of these questions and put them together into an agenda or a climate change mitigation plan that's going to be that's going to have real effect in the future. And outside of that, we're also seeing, from a corporate perspective, we're seeing increased pressure from investors. So organisations like BlackRock, there's a greater focus on climate-related financial disclosures and looking at the risks, but also the opportunities that climate change presents. The FCA and the FRC over the next couple of years are going to likely mandate more stringent or more transparent reporting on identifying what the specific financial risks and financial opportunities are around that. And that's huge in itself, even outside of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 reporting. It's just it's a minefield of other data and connections with other different departments within the company. So through financial reporting, we have to engage really strongly with the procurement team, the finance team, the risk teams, and understanding, communicating to them and making them aware of the role that they play in the bigger picture, because it's no longer just environment and sustainability. Similar to what David has mentioned in terms of during COVID and the impact on carbon emissions that we have seen as a business, at least in the UK. For us, the projects, because we're construction and infrastructure, and there was obviously that sort of push to keep the construction sector going and getting people into work, we haven't seen a huge reduction in terms of carbon emissions in the first 6 months of the year. And so the projects have stayed open, but what we have done, we've adjusted, and we have had new working arrangement times and staggered people's stop and start times, and obviously all the social distancing measures. But largely we have kept a lot of our projects up and running outside of the Scotland region, because they have different set of requirements up there. But outside of that, we've actually just finished our mid-year carbon data assessment, and in the UK we haven't seen that much of a difference in reductions in terms of carbon. I mean, similar to what David has said as well, in terms of our office estate, the COVID has forced us to really look at the permanent estate that we have in the UK, and there has been downsizing, there has been consolidation efforts, and there will be more of those to come before year end. It's very similar that Monday, Tuesdays, we would see the bulk of our employees going into the office, and then the rest of the week they're out on site, or some are working from home. And in Balfour Beatty before COVID, we have had a smart travel policy and measures in place. For example, air travel. We really discourage the use of air travel, and we have done for quite some time. So over maybe the last 18 months, we've seen a massive reduction in that anyway, because of that policy in place. We're going to, I would expect that there will be, by the end of the year, a rebound. So at the minute, obviously people aren't using public transport, so we're not really seeing a huge reduction in them. But I think as and when the recovery packages from the government, and obviously getting everything back to a new normal, we will see a rebound in carbon emissions, maybe from personal vehicle usage, and that's something that we've been trying to lower over the last couple of years. But I don't think that'll be a long-term permanent issue. It will be in the short term, but I think again that'll just go back to the way it was before, and there will be that discouragement of trying to get or encouragement to get people to use public transport. But outside of that, looking ahead for us as a business, our real focus on carbon management, climate change management, and reporting is really on the scope 3. I mean, as I said earlier, we have a mature reporting system and understanding of our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we have targets against that. I mean, we set a target in 2010 to reduce our carbon emissions by 50% based on £1 million turnover, and a year earlier, so that target was to be achieved by the end of 2020. So we overshot that at the end of 2019, and we've increased that to 60% by 2025 based on the 2010 baseline. But we're very conscious of the fact that doesn't include scope 3. Scope 3 is huge for us as a construction. All of the big carbon intensive materials, cement, steel, aggregates, that's all something that we need to tackle. And we're seeing increased pressure from projects, from clients asking us, well, what is the carbon footprint of this asset over its lifetime? There's been increased questions on well, not so much new, but people are understanding standards like PAS 2080 that bit more, and they're wanting to have the project certified to that, because then it demonstrates that there are commitments to lower carbon across the project lifecycle, because one decision that you make even in the early design stages is going to have an impact right through to the end. And the asset life cycle, lifetime, can be up to 100 years, sometimes more. So we really need to make these smart decisions now. So yeah, for us, it's scope 3 reporting and looking at how we can influence our own value chain to begin with, and then the sector, certainly from carbon or construction and infrastructure point of view, how we can influence the wider sector and collaboratively work together to be able to meet the goals that the government set in the net zero by 2050, for example. But I think that there's loads of different things that we could talk about today. So I'm excited to hear the questions that you have, and hopefully we'll be able to respond. Yep.
Super. Thank you very much, Michelle. That's really interesting and a good introduction to the position Balfour Beatty have. I'd like to start the conversation by building on that looking forward piece you were just talking about there, Michelle. And scope 3, supply chain, value chain, is clearly the big prize. many organisations are getting their heads around their own emissions, scope 1 and 2, but looking into the value chain, up and down, whether it's suppliers or customers, and what those impacts are, quite often in the high 90% of your own footprint. Would anyone like to kick me off in terms of, scope 3 is the prize, I suppose, but what within that? There's materials, but different kinds of fuels, different ways of working, different business models that might help get you towards that. David, would you like to pick up from Energy's point of view in terms of how you might be approaching your supply chain or your scope 3 more widely on that point?
Yeah, I can start us off there. It's only fair as it's been a while since I last spoke. So I think the sources of scope 3 for us are from two main areas. One is the more traditional supply chain, which would actually look quite similar to Michelle's, although the priorities would vary, but not so much in working in infrastructure at Energy as we are housing and healthcare and extra care type facilities. But there is clearly a lot of work to do there in terms of particular product groups, bricks, concrete, steel, the usual areas that you'd expect. And if we slip from carbon more onto my other area of waste, there's some significant issues around excavated materials as we move towards more new build construction. The solutions that we're looking at there are quite diverse. One of the main ones I think Joe was already alluded to. He didn't dwell on it as much, probably thinking that we jump in and talk about, which is the concept of off-site construction. It's had numerous acronyms over the years. I think modern modes of construction was one that I found out about the other day, which sort of predated my career, but floating around out there. So the idea there obviously being that if you can build something in a factory setting, then not only can you manage the quality control, but you can actually heavily reduce weight, reduce travel to a centralized construction site, and generally control the whole process. There are some challenges. I was, funnily enough, having a conversation with some of our design team just yesterday, and rather surprisingly, I was informed that the modular version of a lot of the social housing we do at the moment can attract a premium of up to 20%. Which actually runs rather contrary to what we often consider as one of the benefits of off-site construction, which is cost savings. And the challenge that we face is that actually at the moment, the capacity in the UK can't keep up with demand on site. So you're potentially looking at slowing down the build time to allow the factories to produce the units that you would then install much more quickly. You get a bottleneck, essentially. And bottlenecks cost money. So there is a challenge there that we have. Not the same in all installations when we're doing multi-storey car parks or we're doing at the University of Leicester modular bathrooms for student accommodation. It seems to be working very well. But when you look at building whole buildings, whether they're homes or non-domestic, there does seem to be that bottleneck at the moment in the supply chain. The only other issue I mentioned very briefly for us, is the electricity and gas we sell to our customers. We are a very large player on the BDB market in the UK, accounting for an actual percentage of the UK carbon footprint indirectly. And the challenge we have there is customer demand. There's a massive challenge for us, and this does intersect with construction as well in terms of influencing what the customer actually asks. Because both for energy and construction, ultimately we are there to fulfill the needs of the customer. And in our world of construction, perhaps a bit different about, but I'm not entirely sure, we're not often engaged until after the design has been completed, which is very challenging. Yeah. I'll stop there and let someone else come in.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. And I mean, it depends on the type of project with us. I mean, sometimes whether or not, because if it's a DBFMO contract, we will be financing part of it, and we will be part of the design team. I think at the minute it's about a 50-50 split for us, so that we do have some influence on the design, or at least we'll subcontract to a design company and obviously work with them. But yeah, if we're not part of that design team, whether the customer literally sends us the spec of how they want it built. I mean, part of the PAS 2080, for example, I've mentioned before that we still have a part to play in that, and we can still raise and say, look, we think, can you consider the design? It's ultimately not up to us, but we still have that option to be able to say, well, we think if you build it this way, can you consider it at least? So there is still a bit of an influence there, even if we are not the designers. But on the supply chain as a whole, with the GHG protocol, the 15 categories for Scope 3 reporting, and for us, I would say one of the biggest categories is the purchased goods and services piece, which includes the materials, which I mentioned before, which is going to be a huge part of it. But then the other side of it is all of that subcontracting activities, and if we're subcontracting 50, 60, 70, 80% of the work that we do, we're ultimately responsible for that. That's our Scope 3, and we need that information, and we need to start reporting it. I mean, a lot of the companies that we work for, I mean, it ranges from SMEs up to large organisations, and the SMEs are not going to have reporting systems in place as mature and well set up as Balfour Beatty. We've been doing it for 10 years. I mean, they still might not even be subject to new legislation on carbon and energy reporting. And from a cost perspective, I mean, they might just might think that carbon and looking at low carbon solutions or alternatives is just too expensive for them, and it'll just shut them out of being able to participate. And we're trying to, even through our supplier our subcontractor onboarding systems, we have like a heat mapping tool, so we'll ask them questions and we'll understand what their capabilities are before we decide to take them on as a customer, or as a supplier or supply chain member. And even if they don't have all of those things currently, what we are planning to do is develop an improvement plan for them. And we're going to say, well, look, we're not going to cut you out just because you don't have these. We recognise that you're not always going to be as good as people who've been doing this for a long time. So that improvement plan, and we'll then check up on it and say, right, well, what have you done? What might you need support with? And we've already began that process with a lot of our clients. We've held workshops with supply chain members, and just to give them a bit of, because it's all about how we can take them on the journey with us. There's no point in us racing a million miles ahead of everybody else, and we need them to be able to do the work that we want to do. So we have set up a series of workshops, and we've talked to our supply chain partners and explained what our expectations are in terms of what the client expects in Balfour Beatty to do. So we need to communicate that through to our supply chain, just so that it's not a case of, and they're just not thinking, oh, they're demanding more and more and more. We need that information back for a reason, and I think that education is really key to the supply chain and making them understand why we're asking for it. And it's not just a case that we're asking for the information, it's sitting in a folder somewhere, no one's looking at it. We are going to be using that information to make decisions, and if they understand that, I think that's part of the rationale behind, right, I get why this information is important, and how can I improve my processes? How can I streamline my processes so that I'm not sending somebody off to go and get a meter read, for example, or to go and find an invoice that has a quantity on it. And it's just all about making sure that, as I said, them coming along the journey with us. And then the other, with the materials, we've held workshops all early in the year, and it was really going really well up to COVID. We had a lot of workshops in place with our major material suppliers, and we were asking them, what are your low carbon solutions today? What will be your low carbon solutions in 5 years from now? And what is the dream in 20 years? Where do you see this going? And that gives us an understanding. We can communicate that back to the client and say, look, you're wanting a net zero project or an absolute zero project by 2030, 2035. But the materials aren't going to exist until 2040. So it's then them deciding whether or not they want to purchase carbon offsets. So I think at this moment in time, even though there's a rush to get to net zero, and we've got about 10 years, I think, now to keep it within the 1.5 degree warming in terms of setting all of the different legislation and putting a lot of that in place. But it's all about education. that's where I feel at the minute with the supply chain, it's making sure that everybody's on the same page and there's nobody going, no, I'm not doing that, because it's not going to be stable from a business sustainability point of view.
And that's great. I totally agree. It's that kind of awareness raising and education. And Joel, from a client perspective, the end client, how do you see that rippling down through the work that you do on campus?
Yeah, no, that exactly. It's very interesting, and there was a chat point about the client responsibility. I think Michelle's point is quite right in terms of finding ways to educate the client as well. I mean, we're quite lucky enough, I suppose, that we have this net zero carbon target that we've put on ourselves. So it creates the drives, and the university is basically education and the big estate. So we do quite a lot in terms of building construction. So we can move on this ladder of identifying what is it we need to ask to create a better building and a lesser carbon footprint for our estates. But I do fully appreciate that it's not necessarily everybody's priority, and if it's a commercial landlord, they will probably be more interested with the rent than the carbon footprint of their estate, because they don't necessarily pay for the energy. And I think that's my probably interest into the point of David made earlier in terms of the offsite construction can be more expensive. And then maybe just to be rubbing a different way, I'd like to ask, why is it that offsite construction is creating bottleneck and is more expensive? Because, I mean, we live in a world now where money is virtually free. So ordering my building now or 6 months ago probably wouldn't make a huge difference on my interest rate. And for me, it's the same analogy as if I need to buy a book. Well, I'm trying not to go to Amazon, but if I need to buy a book, I don't necessarily need the book to be delivered to me in the next hour. So the analogy, I think that probably clients can also be educating themselves, is not necessarily to put construction companies under such a pressure that everything needs to be delivered for yesterday, and then best intentions have to be sacrificed on the time schedule. So I think there is certainly conversation to be had in terms of what products are available, how much it costs to do them, are factories available in the UK to make a product, and when is it we need to ask for it, not to compromise quality and carbon and efficiency just for saving time, because perhaps we can make plans and not have it this time. So I think it's a very interesting point in terms of looking at the whole scope of a project and deciding what are all the parameters that can be influenceable and influenced. So and certainly we have this problem at the university where, as an organization, we may make decisions late, and it creates this problem of having to make wrong decisions, whereas I think the university could easily decide to start a building a year before. It wouldn't make a big difference as long as it's ready for when the students come back. So,
yes, so there's a lot in there about planning and design and getting all those stakeholders involved.
I think so, yeah.
There's one of the comments that was made by Ken on the chat function about the disconnect between the construction carbon, the cap carb, and the operational carbon, the op carb. Just before I throw it out to the speakers, there's something that we've been developing with plant and machinery operators, where there's that disconnect between the budget holder, the people who hire the piece of kit, and the people who operate the piece of kit. Mm-hmm. And there's a bit of a conflict, a tension in terms of getting the most efficient piece of kit, so your operational costs are low, but then it comes with a higher charge potentially. So you've got this disconnect. So you're trying to reduce your emissions and have the most efficient piece of kit available, but it comes down to who owns the budget. Do any of you of the three speakers see that similar thing when it comes to other aspects of the tension between construction embodied carbon, cap carb, and then the operation of the asset?
I mean, if I can say, this is a topic we are pushing at the moment. I think we've built a consensus inside the estate who is a customer in a way, where we are willing to add into the project decision making whole life cost and whole life carbon assessments. So we're looking at RICS and making ourselves ready to ask the question about, give me a price, are you within the capital cost? but also what's your whole life cost over so many years, taking assumptions of presence and number of staff and so on. I'm sure we'll have struggled with the university in terms of capital cost because it may be more expensive. I suppose I would like the conversation to also, taking your example of the plant and machinery, to also say, yes, this plant may be more expensive, but if it's more reliable and it can be fixed and repaired and maintained at different intervals, it may well be that it should be possible for the rent cost to be the same. In which case, a customer at the end should benefit from something which is more efficient and doesn't cost more.
Or even lower, lower overall.
Exactly. And I think that's also part of the question we need to ask is, I was speaking with one of our architects this morning, and perhaps us as a client, we don't put the challenge right enough and say what's important to me? Well, cost, quality, carbon, they're all important, so off you go. And perhaps we don't ask those questions.
So are we seeing carbon rise up the agenda in terms of those kind of award decision criteria as well? You've got cost, delivery.
To be honest, I mean, our commitment is 6 months old, 12 months old. So I think we have the carbon going up, absolutely. I think the university understands it has a duty there, but perhaps it hasn't reached the point of being as important as other, say, pre-existing parameters. So there's still work to be done there, but I'm hopeful, yes.
And is there, Michelle, is there something there about stimulus, about investing in with your suppliers and your contractors?
Well, yes. So I mean, we have with our plant and equipment specifically, our procurement team, the group buyers, they have these conversations, and we would have much better conversation and communication with them compared to maybe 3 years ago. And we actively talk about the energy efficiency of that plant and equipment, the carbon emissions, not only just carbon emissions, but also around air quality, because there's obviously a huge piece on that as well, and making sure that those environmental considerations are part of those decision making. So, I mean, it certainly has come up, and I mean, around the higher cost, I mean, they are conversations that we have been having, certainly in the last 12 to 18 months with our supply chain. And I mean, there's no easy answer at the minute, partly because if we're going to request more electric plant equipment fleet, I mean, it's all about demand as well, and the availability of that piece of plant and equipment. And if it's not being asked for, if it's not being able to be produced, obviously the costs are going to be high. It's just a fact of it. And until economies of scale come into it and those costs start to come down, we would expect to see a slight increase in higher costs for those more expensive pieces of equipment. But then that's why the whole life cycle assessment of that piece of machinery really comes into play. And I think those people making those decisions need to really understand it as well. And I would expect that most of them would, in terms of the asset of it. And I don't know, maintenance, if maintenance is going to be reduced compared to the previous model, then I don't see why a more efficient product that's a lower carbon alternative, if it makes sense to go down that route and purchase that, even if it is in the short term has a higher cost or purchase cost, then that's the cost of carbon. So, and the cost of a low carbon economy as of today, as I said, hopefully that cost will reduce over time, but
I see a lot in the work that we do and interact with suppliers. Whole life costing is a great idea, but for some, there's still that immediate capital cost, sadly. But I think things are changing, but it's going to be a slow process. David, would you like to offer any thoughts on that?
I guess from my perspective, the challenge that I see in most of this conversation is kind of assuming that the suppliers or contractors own the assets that we're talking about, the JCBs, the welfare units, the generators. We don't. I can speak for our company and the subsidiaries that have existed in the past. I'm sure for the industry more widely. If you have a welfare cabin that costs you £10 extra a week because it has solar on it, and you only save £2 a week, for example, that is going to be the same every week. You will never get a return on investment on that. Now, I am the environmentalist. I believe that put the onus both on the influencing of the customer on the one hand that we discussed earlier, and secondly in terms of the company and its own vision. And again, if you do go down the road of, well, we are going to be a net zero carbon, we understand that we will take a little bit of a hit in one place, but take a win in terms of enhanced quality scoring and tenders in another place, then maybe we can make that work. And one of the ways of doing that would obviously be through carbon offsetting or some other form of internal carbon pricing, which allows you to then do things in one area compensated for in another area. You know, so if your welfare was never going to pay back, but the divisions using that essentially through offsetting or through that internal carbon price pay for that through another business area. So it's I wouldn't want to just say it's all down to the customer. There are things that we can do as the contractor, and obviously we can work with suppliers as well. But the basic problem is that we don't own the assets. Going back to Ken's original question, I think that gap is always going to be there until we zoom out and factor in the wider life cycle.
Cool. So there's because there's obviously many different facets to this. It's not just about, you know, picking an innovative piece of kit or a lower carbon material. There's all the bureaucracy and admin that goes with it, the culture that goes with it, and how that works on a day-to-day basis. I suppose the next thing for me is around innovation. We've talked about lower carbon materials and maybe more efficient equipment, but that's taking small steps, relatively speaking. What do you see as the I don't know, the paradigm shifts? It's a bit of a cliche, but what is the big change, if there is one, even to work us towards that net zero end game in 2050? Taking the context of the last few months into account, what do you see as those big game changers outside of the little incremental steps that we all know of?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I mean, our carbon footprint globally, gas, oil and diesel use accounts for 80% of our carbon footprint. So for us, the innovation needs to be shifting away from diesel, gas, oil types of machinery and plant movements on site. So innovations on things like electric piling rigs or more efficient hybrid solutions for generators where we're not able to connect to the grid and to power the site compound. Innovation around all of that. I mean, and again, that's taken it beyond the control of Balfour Beatty, because if we can't connect to the grid, it's not because Balfour Beatty can't do it, it's because there's restrictions with the DNO, or, you know, the costs are just too high for the client to approve connecting to the grid. So the only option is to use diesel generators to power it and to charge and to use the equipment on site. If we can't get a grid connection to the site, we're not obviously going to bring in electric plant and equipment to use, because we're not going to start charging them up on a diesel generator. Do you know? So there's a lot of talk around whether or not or carving up where we can allocate electric plant and equipment on those really intensive projects where they're not connected to the grid, or even on where they are. So innovation throughout the value chain with those big plant and machinery suppliers is really key. That collaboration with them and seeing where they're going, that'll help us reduce and get to a zero carbon target.
Cool. As we've all seen over the last few months, we've all been able to work virtually, or most of us have, off and on. So that's obviously one key aspect. David, anything from your viewpoint in terms of innovation? I
mean, in terms of, I think I'll tackle it a little bit differently, if that's okay, just to give a different flavour. I think we really need, in addition to what business can do, is some of those policy paradigm shifts, you would like. It's been discussed internationally for years, the concept of a carbon tax, which is obviously separate from things like offsetting. And I think trying to, when you start looking at your value chain, it is so complicated. You're only ever going to be able to prioritise and address certain areas key to you. But we need everyone to be changing at the same time. And that's where I think a carbon tax may be one of the only ways, particularly one that's cross-border. This is where you get incredibly complicated, but a cross-border carbon would be the paradigm shift, to use your term, that we would need. In terms of what the UK specifically should be looking to do, and obviously areas that touch into my world, on the energy side, we need a decision on heating policy in the UK. At the moment, there is a debate going on between electrification versus hydrogen versus biomethane, or some hybrid approach. ENGIE have recently published papers on this. There's been a series of consultations, both from a domestic and a non-domestic perspective, but there's no clear guidance, medium or long term. And clearly the investments, particularly if we go down a large-scale hydrogen or a large-scale electrification route, are immense and are measured in decades. Are we going to have to double the capacity of the national grid? Are we going to have to build an entirely parallel hydrogen gas infrastructure to go alongside the natural gas one? These decisions, which will be heavily influenced by and impact upon ENGIE, are that is where you will get a lot of the decarbonisation for the next 2 or 3 decades. The electrification or the decarbonisation of our grid has already occurred. It's largely locked in now, and it will be very low by the end of this decade. The ESO's reports from the grid are to be believed. The heating, and once you have an idea around heating, that will then inform your decision making around heavy industry and transportation. It's all connected. If you do electrify heating and electrify transport at the same time, you have big problems. And that's a key decision that will impact all of us, but obviously it needs to be made at the top, at the front, so that we can actually then make smarter decisions ourselves and don't end up with stranded assets and all the rest. And because I've largely used up my time, I'll simply drop in carbon capture, use and storage. Well, and if we can combine that with biomass, then at the very least we'll buy ourselves more time.
Yeah, and that last response, I think, answers one of the questions that someone has asked about concrete being an obvious area for innovation. In terms of innovation, yeah, different concrete mixes need to be explored, tried and tested. Carbon capture and storage needs to be part of that solution as well.
Yeah, there's a lot around concrete and cement. The supply chain school ran an event, it's probably 18 months ago now, about low carbon concrete solutions, and there are many of them out there, lots of technologies, but there's lots of other barriers to them, and that's probably a topic for another webinar in and of itself, in terms of testing and approvals and warranties and so on. But it's definitely, in my view at least, part of that mix. There's lots of innovation and R&D going on into that. I'm conscious that we're coming up to the half hour. The one final thing I want to throw out, and I'll come to Joel first of all, there's something you mentioned earlier about the other knock-on impacts. If we look at carbon, there's air quality impacts, there's biodiversity impacts, there's consumption of natural resources, even into well-being, if you're looking at the biodiversity side of things. How do you see that developing, as that discussion developing, starting from a carbon point of view, and then saying, well, if we can be low carbon, we can be low air quality, and develop out that discussion?
Yeah, I think, yeah, well, that's definitely a hard and vast one, but maybe linking with the question before, and probably on the air quality and carbon point. I found the innovation point of Michel very interesting, and it's true that renewable energy is the only way to decarbonize all businesses all throughout the supply chain. But I think the one thing I've been preaching for years is efficiency and reducing consumption. I don't have the number in my head, but I'm sure I've seen that every year, out of the millions of tons of material which are used through our businesses and construction and our economy, a vast majority is virgin material which is dug out of the ground somewhere. And I think, in addition to the innovation, the renewable energies which we need to have, we probably should be looking at the question of how can we make recycling chains and recycling supply chains better. All those materials we use, we're just not given a chance to make those recycling supply chain viable economically. It's just too cheap to buy new. So that point links also with David's carbon tax point, because if we don't have to dig it out of the ground, then I don't have to use a huge digger to go and rain the countryside, and there's less dust and less air pollution, and probably less coal in China. Yes, it has all the implications on employment and everything, but I think it has. I think we probably all are in the middle of this hard discussion about. We know we have to change. We kind of start figuring out how we need to change, but yes, there will be impact on employment. And one thing we haven't discussed is how do all those jobs and companies and businesses need to change. But I'm convinced it's for the better, as you say, noise, air quality, health. But there's a long way still to go, and lots of parameters we haven't quite controlled. So, but yeah, efficiency and efficient use of natural resources absolutely key for me as well.
That's a key point.
It is an interesting point to finish on as well. That risk that goes well beyond carbon or even the environment, which is the sort of societal. If you were to drop an environmental axe on everything, of course, the best solution is to do nothing for almost every environmental problem. And that's sort of something I alluded to, I think, in my introduction was my closing sort of thought there around the need for societal and political change or economic change. I'm not sure how far we can go without some understanding that, I'm going to say it, the capitalist model has a flaw, and we're all trying to work within it. But it's an incremental improvement, which of course we're all trying to move beyond. I'm not sure how far we can within that model.
Indeed. There's a great book on that point about the capitalist model. It's called Prosperity Without Growth by Professor Tim Jackson. If you haven't read it, to anyone, I recommend you go and get a copy off a book-selling website, not necessarily Amazon. It's a good read, and it's in layman's speak, so it's not in kind of university-level economic speak, but it's all to that point, David. Okay, we're a couple of minutes over. Thank you to my three speakers. That's been very interesting from all your points of view and all your interesting thoughts and ideas. I hope that's been enjoyable. Some of the takeaways for me have been that climate change, as we know, is an amplifier. In and of itself, it's very important, but it's so interconnected with many other impacts, and resource consumption is one of the big ones. You know, if we use stuff, it inherently brings with it a consumption of carbon and an emission of carbon dioxide. It's clear to me that there's no one solution, there's no one silver bullet to sort this out. There are many different routes. Now, whether we're talking a mix of electricity and hydrogen and solar panels, or whether we're talking low carbon cement, low carbon steel, whatever the aspect we're looking to tackle, there are many different ways of slicing and dicing this. So it is complicated, it's multifaceted, but there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of optimism, and I think that the thing I'm going to conclude with is that when the whole lockdown started, for some reason, my GCSE history came back to me and said to me that when the Great Fire of London happened, there was a great opportunity that Christopher Wren saw to rebuild London on a grid system, a lot more efficient, a lot cleaner, better, no slums. But of course, when the fires died down and the embers were swept away, everyone rebuilt their buildings on exactly the same footprint. They went back to exactly what they'd always done before, which is why we've got the fantastic street layout of London as it is today. So there was a slight upside. I'm hoping that we can seize this opportunity now, not to go back to exactly what we were doing 5-6 months ago, and take stock and see that opportunity to move forward to something different. So with that, thank you everyone for joining and listening, and thank you to my three speakers again, and we'll see you all soon.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.